Hello, and welcome to the Beyond Borders podcast, the podcast that explores topics related to international trade. This podcast is brought to you by Buckland. For over 70 years, Buckland has been working to help companies across the world experience global trade in a better way. As a customer-focused company, we provide you with a single source of unmatched customs brokerage, trade managed solutions, freight forwarding, trade technologies, and warehousing and distribution services. I'm your host, Jenny Kaus, Marketing and Communications Specialist at Buckland, and today I am speaking with our guest, Chris Borganis. Chris is a supervisor for classification in our Compliance Services office in Southfield, Michigan, and has been with Buckland for 3 years. Chris is a licensed customs broker and holds his Certified Customs Specialist designation. Chris focuses on classification and specializes in OEM automotive, aftermarket machinery, and testing apparatuses. Welcome to the podcast for the fourth time, Chris.
Thanks, Jenny. It's always fun to come back. And I see those numbers are climbing up on us.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you back again because our conversations are always so great and I always learn so much, and I know that our listeners do too. Chris, you're joining me today to talk about HTS updates. On previous episodes of the Beyond Borders podcast, we've discussed the Harmonized system and classification, and I would recommend checking out those podcasts if our listeners find that this is a topic of interest to you. So HS, as it's called in Canada, or HTS, as it's called in the US, is that correct, Chris?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. That refers to the Harmonized system or the Harmonized Tariff system, which refer to the same thing in the respective countries. This is the numbering system to classify items being imported or exported that identifies them for tariff and statistical purposes. This list of codes is updated quite regularly, and this updating process is what we're going to be discussing today. We will discuss how often these updates happen, the different types of changes that can occur, and how to best prepare yourself and your business. Chris, I understand that this is a very timely conversation that we're having as these updates happen at the beginning of the year, and this podcast is released on January the 2nd, which is right at the start of our new year.
Yeah, Jenny, that's absolutely correct. The largest updates to the HTS codes or HS codes is almost always right at the beginning of the year. So while we see updates at other points throughout the year, typically as an example, there's one in early July, and smaller ones at other points throughout the year. This one coming up at the beginning of the new year is almost always the largest that we see.
Okay. And this is so important for people because this changes, the tariff, and that changes what they would be paying in terms of duties. So this is something that people definitely want to be aware of. Are these changes that occur usually, big changes, like numbers really changed, or are they more small? Like how drastic are we talking?
So it depends on the release. The changes can be minor with minimal impacts. There's times where we see practically no changes, or there's times that we see just a few HTS codes. They would change from meaning one number to meaning another without any difference in what their interpretation of what they cover. But at times we see very large changes that can sweep across, hundreds of tariffs, and that can bring in new codes and new things that require, new detail on the importer's part.
Okay. So what types of changes are there?
Yeah, that's a good question. So typically, we see three types of changes that the HS codes could change. So one, which is the most simple, which is kind of what I was talking about earlier, is a one-to-one change. So this would be a case where a specific code is expiring or it's being phased out, and a new code is generated that has a different number, so a different 10-digit HS number, but that new HS number falls under the exact same criteria. So as an example, your HS code, it could be, for an AC unit, it there's no new rules on an AC unit, but there's a new number that is being enacted for that unit. So that's the one-to-one changes. The next, which is slightly more complicated, would be the many-to-one changes. So this happens sometimes where there is a new single code that replaces the criteria of 3 or 2 pre-existing codes which are no longer active. So in this case, if there were 2 different types of AC units that are now covered under one new HS code, but the criteria of those 2 different types didn't change, this would be a many-to-one code. The next main group would be one-to-many, and this is where a lot of the difficulties come in. So this would be when there is one code that, with the update, could now be represented by many codes. We saw an example of this in the U.S. in the July 1st update. And so this example was the code 8517.62.0050, which was phased out. So that previously existing code was phased out, and it was replaced with 2 options. So the options were 8517.62.0020 or 8517.62.0090. And essentially they took one catch-all provision and they split it into 2. So in this specific case, there was a separate section for voice transmission, switching, and routing apparatuses. So it would have been routers for the most part. And then there was still the other catch-all item. So it's when you see these new informational breakouts that there really is, it's the hardest part to determine how the changes are going to affect clients.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So I can see how when, say, technology changes and, new devices come out that never existed before, and, you have a lot of these different types of them, how you would need to address that through perhaps some new codes, through some updates, and then as well as other things become less relevant and show up less.
Yeah.
You could probably be condensing those codes a little bit. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's exactly accurate. And it's also difficult too, because sometimes, if you're looking at it from an importer standpoint in a one-to-many, you may have hundreds or thousands of items that you're currently using a single HS code for. And now you need to, specify which of them meet this new criteria and which of them don't. So we saw another one recently, and I believe this was last year. We saw there was a new statistical breakout for extension cords as opposed to cables. So companies had to go through and kind of break out which of their cables were extension cords and which of them were not.
Wow.
While you can kind of look at, you can look at your parts and kind of easily determine if something's an extension cord or if something's a cable, you don't necessarily know in advance. You don't necessarily have, this one's an extension cord and this one's not in advance. So you have to go through and individually look at each item, which is where this really becomes a problem for importers each year. Because typically, for the U.S., the tariff is released earlier in the year when it immediately goes effective. So you get this information, let's say in the morning on the 2nd, and all of a sudden you need it for live imports.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Wow, that happens pretty quick.
Yeah.
So I understand at the beginning of this podcast when we mentioned that there was HS and HTS, and we were talking about one being Canadian and one being in the US. I'm kind of wondering, are these updates handled the same in Canada and the United States? I understand. Chris is in Southfield, Michigan, and he's joining me by phone today. So, here I sit in Canada and here you sit in the United States. And I'm curious as to if these updates are handled differently in Canada and the United States.
Yeah, so they definitely are. In general, maybe I'm betraying my own country here, but Canada handles it much more proactively. And so they give importers a little bit more time to process that information. The U.S. handles it much more, last minute. With every release. One thing I can say that there is some bit of information that's handled, uniformly across the U.S. and Canada and other countries. So, as you were discussing, you had the previous podcasts on the harmonized tariff system. And one thing that we discussed in those previous podcasts is that the first 6 digits of an HS code are harmonized. That's where the H comes from in HTS across the WTO and with all of the countries within the WTO. Mm-hmm. So the WTO actually does work to update the 6-digit levels uniformly across countries. But typically the more difficult releases and difficult changes to process are on those 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th digits. And that is where the two countries kind of handle it differently.
Gotcha. As it gets more specific down to the country level.
Yeah. Yeah. And, one thing that we talked about in the past too is that, so the 8th digit would be the duty level. So that's once you get to 8 digits of a 10-digit HS code, that's where the duty is determined. And then the 9th and 10th digits determine statistical purposes. So any changes at the 9th and 10th digit level, those are clearly because one of the governments are trying to learn more information about the specific commodity imports. So that's when, if the U.S. or Canadian governments are making changes at the 9th and 10th digits, it means that they want to know some more information about the types of parts being brought in. Mm-hmm. So when I talked about routers up above, essentially what that change amounted to was that the U.S. government who made that change wanted to know, instead of this larger category of data machines, they wanted to know, how many routers and switching apparatuses specifically are brought in each year, which is really interesting. And it depends on the country, and it depends on the political climate. It also depends on, new types of technology, like you were talking about before, when or if we see those 9th and 10th digit changes.
Mm-hmm. And I would imagine, we were talking about the whole intent with HS is classifying and knowing what you're paying in terms of tariffs and also for statistical data. And I would think that statistical data really informs these discussions about what needs to be added, removed, changed, because they'll be able to track and see where there's increases, reductions, and where things need to be addressed.
Yeah. And so the statistical data is used in a wide range of government activities, from, labor statistics to, what you typically would hear about is, the export, like if you have a surplus, of exports or not. But it's used and shared across multiple government agencies, for both governments or any governments that keep track of it.
Mm-hmm. So we were discussing, that there can be, in Canada, there's a little bit more lead up and knowledge of what's happening. In the United States, there's a little bit less. Is there a way, for someone who's listening, and they want to have their business be prepared for these changes, is there any advice that you can give in terms of how to prepare for changes to the HS or HTS?
Yes, there definitely is. I guess I can go into that a little bit more. So Canada typically releases their tariff about mid-December. So this year, CBSA has already released their tariff updates, with their actually having going into effect on December 30th of this year, as opposed to early in January. So anyone can go on CBSA's website and they can see the tariff as it will stand on December 30th. For the U.S. government, releases those on January 2nd or on January 3rd or on January 4th. And when it's released, it's immediately active. So in terms of preparing, we're left with a little bit different situation. Either way, for both countries, I think the most important thing to do to prepare would be to have a full set of all the part numbers and all of the tariff codes that you are using for entry, and kind of assembling a full list, an all-encompassing list of all of your tariff codes and part numbers. So how that would relate is that in Canada, when CBSA releases their changes, you can then, do a bump to see which of your, what codes have been deactivated and what codes are still active. And you can then compare that against your commodity database. It's, once you have all of your HTS codes or HS codes in this case, because it's Canada, assembled in one place, that's not too hard to do to at least identify the parts that are going to require a second look. Once you require a second look, then you would have to look through to see if it's a one-to-one change or if it's a many-to-one, or if it's a one-to-many change. But that's kind of how you would go through there. The hard part would be getting the data to flag it.
Right.
In the U.S., it's a little bit different. So while you still want to have, your data all set and leveled out in advance, you don't have as much time. So for Canada, an importer can spend, 2 weeks, 3 weeks looking through the data, processing it, and then, saying, here are the codes that I need to change in advance. In the U.S., what you're going to have to do is the same thing, but in a much quicker, almost a little scrambled fashion. Once the codes are released, you're essentially going to have to, process that data and immediately see and change as you go which items are affected.
Okay. Yeah, that does certainly seem like a bit more of a challenge to be prepared in the US. It seems like in Canada, it's a bit more of, okay, how are we going to prepare ourselves? What's going to be the impact? And, leading up, whereas with the United States, it's here are the changes. What was the impact on us?
Yeah. And so I guess there are a couple ways that, some U.S. companies glean some information from their ABI reps. But in my instance, sometimes the information, gained in advance from ABI reps ends up being incorrect. So it's caused extra work. So to me, for the U.S., the best way is to be prepared and to keep all your codes in a database and then have a process and a team ready to work it as soon as it's released.
Mm-hmm. That makes complete sense. That's good advice. So for Canada, were the changes, since we do know what the changes for Canada will be, were they big changes this year?
Yeah, surprisingly, no. I always hope it's not going to heavily affect our clients because it makes it harder on the client sometimes when we need more specific information on items. But in both the manufacturing and automotive industries, where the majority of our clients classify items, I did not see any major changes for the December 30th Canadian release. So, like I said, that when this goes live, CBSA will still have the new tariffs on their website. So if anyone wants to look on their own, they can as well.
And I'll certainly post a link to that in the notes for this on our website as well, if people want to look into that.
Yeah. So one thing I can say is that typically for both Canada and the U.S., we see a couple prevalent one-to-many, tariff changes in each release on January 1st. So that's why I say I was surprised that I didn't see any major ones for the December 30th Canadian release. And I was kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop while we were processing our clients' information, and it was nice that it didn't.
Nice. Yeah, because I would imagine, some years are a surprise this year or this way, and some years are a surprise the other way, where there will be a lot of changes.
Yes, of course. And it's much better to be on this side.
Yes. Well, and who knows what the remainder of the year will hold as well, because you did mention that it does happen several times a year.
Yeah.
Yeah. And for all of these changes, we will certainly be providing information through our newsletter and on our website. So please do check in with us if you want more information about this. If someone who is listening has a question about any of this, Chris, how can Buckland help?
Oh, they should definitely not, be left questioning on how to process and forward these changes. If they have any questions, they should reach out to customer service group, which is at csagroup@buckland.com. And we've got a great team there that can get them in touch with the right people internally and help them along with this difficult process.
That's a great tip. And once again, that's csagroup@buckland.com. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions about this podcast, about these HS and HTS updates, or anything in general. Our team there is ready to help. Chris, thank you so much for taking the time yet again to talk to me on the podcast, specifically today about HTS updates. Thank you so much.
Thanks for bringing me back, Jenny. It's always fun. I'm sure I'll be back again to have another chat with you.
Yes, I won't be letting you off the phone until we've booked our next one for sure.
Okay.
That's the Beyond Borders podcast for today. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you to our guest, Chris Borganis, for joining us and for sharing your expertise. If you're looking for more resources related to international trade, check out buckland.com and click the Learning section across the top of the website. Here, you'll find a range of resources, including learning guides, webinars, and podcasts. Our downloadable learning guides include Incoterms charts, common trade terminology, and many more. We also host live monthly webinars, invite you to sign up to secure your spot for an informative presentation followed by a Q&A session. The best way to keep up to date on all of these resources is through our weekly newsletter. We send out a weekly newsletter every Wednesday containing our latest resources, as well as a roundup of the latest trade news delivered right to your inbox. If you don't already receive our newsletter, you can sign up on the bottom of any page on our website. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us through our website's Contact Us page, through Twitter, where our handle is @BucklandTweets, on LinkedIn on our Buckland Company page, or like we said, through CSA Group at buckland.com. Thank you for listening to the Beyond Borders podcast, and be sure to tune in again and subscribe for more great conversations about importing, exporting, and everything else in the world of logistics and international trade.